Thank you very much and welcome. I hope you can hear me okay. So, my name is Misha Glenny. I am the rector of the Institute for Human Sciences, an advanced research institute in Vienna. But in a previous life, I was a foreign correspondent for the BBC. But that's by the way, because you've all come here to listen to Andrea Wulf. And today we're going to talk about Andrea's latest book, Magnificent Rebels. I want to do a little bit of scene setting for you. Magnificent Rebels takes place in the 1790s, largely the 1790s. So there are times, particularly in European literary history, that we've noticed that a group of people have come together in a particular place at a particular time and changed the nature of European literary and philosophical development. I'm thinking of Paris in the 1920s, for example, when you had F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Chagall, Picasso, and Mondrian, Josephine Baker, Gertrude Stein, were a revolutionary force in European literature and art. Similarly, around the same time, the Bloomsbury set in the United Kingdom, Virginia Woolf and all her friends. And in England, there was another period at the beginning of the 19th century where you had the emergence of English Romanticism around figures like Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. In the United Kingdom, those characters are very well known. What's less known in the United Kingdom, and indeed in other parts of the world, is that all this was preceded by actually a much more influential group of people coming together in a small town in Germany, to quote John le Carré, which is Jena in Saxony, which is in the middle of Germany. And these people are the subject of Andrea's latest book. And it is an absolutely fascinating mixture of the personal, the literary, the political, and the philosophical, which has had a huge impact on the development of German thought in particular, but European thought in general. So all this took place, of course, to the background of the French Revolution and then later on the Napoleonic Wars. So that's just by way of an introduction so you know roughly where we are. And I want to start by asking Andrea, who were these people, and why did they come together in Jena, a small town in Saxony, in the 1790s?
So maybe we start talking a little bit about Germany at that time, because I think it's very important, because Germany at the end of the 18th century was not a unified country. It was a patchwork of 1,500 states ranging from tiny principalities to big, powerful states such as Austria and Prussia. And one advantage of this fragmentation was that censorship was quite difficult to enforce in Germany. So each state had their own little sets of rules. So it was much easier to publish revolutionary ideas than, say, in centrally ruled states such as England or France. And unlike Spain, France, England, which had colonies and a kind of global reach, and Germany everything was kind of fragmented and inward looking. So the German imagination was really fed by words and by books. So it was a place where So the Germans became fanatical readers. Everybody was reading, from the servant to the king. There were more universities in the German states than anywhere else. For example, there were around 50 in the German states compared to only 2 in England. So it was really a place that encouraged the circulation of ideas. So then you have Jena. And Jena is a very strange little town. It was very small, 4,500 inhabitants. It took less than 10 minutes to cross. It's about 150 miles southwest of Berlin. And it had a university. And the university is really the reason why Jena was so different than other places. Because there was almost 900 students, and the university, through complicated inheritance laws, where the university was ruled or controlled by 4 different Saxon dukes with no one really in charge. So professors could teach there pretty much everything they wanted. It also helped that the ruler was kind of enlightened. So what happened was that thinkers and writers and philosophers who had problems with the rulers in their home states all came to Jena. And one of the most famous was Friedrich Schiller, the famous playwright who wrote a play called The Robbers, for which he was imprisoned in his home state. Schiller then almost functioned like a magnet for a younger generation. So the more liberally thinking professors and thinkers arrived in Jena, the more other liberal thinking students and professors also arrived. And it's so much so that, so you get a sense of how different Jena was. There's a very strange statistic. There are 1/4 of all children born in Jena at that time were born out of wedlock. So there was something going on in that place. Definitely.
Andrea, you mentioned Friedrich Schiller, who is, of course, if not the outstanding figure of early modern German drama. But there's another character who's attracting everyone, and that is Goethe. Tell us about Goethe, who wasn't actually in Jena. He was just down the road
in Weimar.
In Weimar. To give you a sense of the geography, this is sort of southwest of Berlin by about 100 miles or so.
Yeah,
and tell us about Goethe.
So Weimar is only 15 miles away from Jena, very, very close by. So Goethe, at the end of the 18th century, so in the 1790s, is really Germany's most celebrated poet. He became a literary superstar in the 1770s when he wrote The Sorrows of the Young Werther. He was also, he worked very closely with the court and with the Duke, so he was a privy councillor, and he lived in Weimar, and he was so famous that everybody who stopped there kind of, came to look at him. So for him, Jena was a place where he could hide from other people. And in 1794, he met Schiller finally, and the two struck up a friendship that has become, for many academics, and I think that it's right, one of the most important literary friendships in Europe. They, at that time when they met, both men had really reached a kind of dry patch in their creativity. And they were very, very different. So you have Schiller, who's very tall, quite gangly, always ill, who loves to write with his drawer full of rotten apples. He loved the smell, that kind of really made him creative. And then you have, and he felt always tense. He never liked going outside, so he was, always inside writing. And then you have Goethe, much more kind of rotund and jolly, someone who never had to worry about money because he came from a wealthy enough family, and who was very short. So these two very different men kind of struck up a friendship, challenging each other, editing each other's work. I mean, line by line by line, beautiful when you see the letters between them, how they pushed and challenged each other. So they are really at the heart of this kind of circle of friends in Jena.
Now, I just want very briefly to dwell upon that short novel that you mentioned that Goethe wrote, The Sorrows of Young Werther, because in a sense this was the beginning of the explosion of Romanticism. Why was the impact of The Sorrows of Young Werther so great in Germany and in Europe, indeed?
So it is a novel about a lover who commits suicide because he's so unhappily in love, and it kind of hit this. So it was this kind of emotional moment, this kind of sentimentality. It was about the self. It was about this, how I feel is actually really important. And there's a letter that Byron actually wrote to Goethe many, many years later, and he said to him, so Byron thought that Werther had killed more men than Napoleon, because there was this wave of suicides after that. It was so hugely popular that there was in the novel Goethe describes what Werther is wearing, and it was called the Werther uniform. So young men would kind of wear exactly the kind of the dress that he was wearing. There was the Chinese produced porcelain with kind of scenes from Werther. So it was hugely important.
So the reason why I highlight that is because of what then happens in 1794. You have Goethe and Schiller attracting all these people, and one of them is a really extraordinary young character called Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Why did everyone get so excited about this young man pitching up in Jena?
So Fichte is a philosophy professor. He is really famed and feared for his volatile temperament. So this is a man who never talked quietly. He shouted from his lectern. He stomped rather than walked. He ate his snuff tobacco rather than inhaling it. His students called him the Bonaparte of philosophy. He was hugely popular, so popular that students would stand outside on ladders looking through the windows into the auditorium. And there was something really kind of defiant and angry about him. And he was someone who believed that philosophy was not something for just philosophy students, but important for society in general. And what he, at a time, so this is a time when most of Europe is still held in the iron fist of absolutism. And what Fichte did is he gave us free will and self-determination. So he said, the self posits its own being. So the self, in a way, creates itself and what he calls the non-self, the non-Ich in German, the knowledge about the external world. So it is a hugely important moment, and it shows thinkers and the young students that there is a completely different possibility. This is not a world anymore where their lives is ruled by monarchs, but by our own free will. And this is, of course, the time of the French Revolution. And without the French Revolution, Fichte would have never had his philosophy, come up with his philosophy like this. This is really the French Revolution, is the spark that lights this movement. And I think what we sometimes forget is that how dramatic and how pivotal the French Revolution was. So this is a time when the French revolutionaries declare all men equal, it is the moment when it promises a future that is built on the power of words, ideas, and freedom. So this is the time when philosophy really leaves the ivory tower of rarefied thought and arrives in the minds of ordinary people. This is the moment when writers, when philosophers realize, my pen can change the world, not swords, not guns, but my pen and my word. And I think it's a hugely exciting moment for thinkers and artists.
So we'll come to some of the characters who then pitch up and who are as keen to see Fichte and Schiller and Goethe as everyone else. But I want to start with how you begin the book which is with Carolina. And Carolina has a really fascinating story. You've referred to the French Revolution a couple of times. Why do you begin with Carolina's story before she arrives in Jena, and why does she become so important?
So Carolina, let me introduce her properly.
Yes.
Carolina Michaelis Böhmer Schlegel Schelling. So a woman who carries the name of her father and her 3 husbands. And she is really at the center of this book. And quite surprisingly for me, so when I started writing the proposal for this book, for me she was just the wife of August Wilhelm Schlegel, who was a very important literary critic and linguist. And as I was reading her letters, it became very clear that she's the heart and soul of this group of men. And she's not just the muse. And we tend to very often describe women who have these salons, these literary salons in the 18th century. They're just the muse. She's not. She is a driving force, intellectual driving force of this group. And her background is absolutely fascinating. That's why I start the book with her. So she marries very young, as so many women at her age. She was the daughter of a very well-known German scholar, and she was brought up on a diet of literature, poetry, politics, philosophy. She was highly educated. She spoke several languages fluently, but she was married quite young. And then, luckily for her, really, she was widowed by the age of 24. She never really liked her husband very much. And she was quite pleased. So she went on to hang out with German revolutionaries in Mainz.
Explain where Mainz is.
Mainz is near Frankfurt, and it was for a very brief moment. This is the very first republic in Germany. It didn't last very long, only a few months.
Backed by the French.
Backed by the French.
So this was really tense because it was a foreign power that was
taking over. Yeah. So she was hanging out with these crazy, mad young revolutionaries, and so by then she's in her late 20s. And she gets imprisoned by the Prussians. And she goes to prison with her 7-year-old daughter. And then in prison, she discovers that she's pregnant after a one-night stand with an 18-year-old French soldier. So, quite something. At a time when it was regarded scandalous behavior if you were just on your own in the room with a man. But she's really she's not deterred by these obstacles. When she leaves prison a few months later, she gives birth, she kind of zigzags through Germany. No city really wants to kind of have her, because she's called a revolutionary whore. And she says, like, well, hold on a second, why should my life be at an end for a kind of little mistake that would have meant nothing had I been a man? And she meets August Wilhelm Schlegel, who is 4 years younger than her and who's always adored and loved her, and she never really. And she thinks that, you know what, I think it'll be quite good to get married to him. Gives me a new name, a new beginning. So he marries her, takes her to Jena in the summer of 1796, and she really then creates the kind of, she is the kind of vortex of this group.
And Schlegel is important, the husband. Why is he important, and what's her role in Schlegel? Because Schlegel really does something very important.
So all of these people, I know for most of you these names are just random names, but they are the literary superstars in Germany. And this is, I think, that when I was for the first time walking through Jena, when I was doing the research for the Humboldt book, I just couldn't believe all the names that I had learned about in school were kind of like these name plaques on the houses. So August Wilhelm Schlegel is a brilliant linguist and is famous for his Shakespeare translation. So he translates the first German verse translation of Shakespeare, which to this day is the standard edition. So every German school child, when they read Shakespeare, will read his translation, which turns out is not his translation at all. He translated it together with Carolina. So she's very, very important. Is her cover on the book? No, it is just his name. She becomes the editor of their literary magazine. She writes reviews under her husband's name. So she is very, very influential on this group. And I think, it doesn't stop there, because so August Wilhelm Schlegel's brother, Friedrich, who's also in Jena, falls in love with her. And then she takes Friedrich Schelling, who's a young philosopher, as her lover, who's 12 years younger. And her husband doesn't really mind, because he has another lover. So it goes on.
So the reason why I mentioned Schlegel and Carolina in particular is that German culture adopts Shakespeare in a way that no other culture has. In fact, a lot of Germans believe that really Shakespeare was German in spirit and not English. This was just an error of birth, that he actually was meant to be born in Germany. And the impact of works like Shakespeare coming online begins to proliferate all over the German-speaking world, again attracting more people. What I really like about Andrea's book is that much of it is based upon the diaries and the extraordinary exchange of letters to these people, even though they were living in the same town. They're writing to each other the whole time. And so tell us about, and of course they were very good writers on the whole. Tell us about some of the younger poets who this community of Fichte and Schlegel and Carolina, Goethe and Schiller began to attract, because they had some quite dramatic stories too.
Yeah. So you're right. It has been so much fun reading these letters, because they are poets, and they're quite gossipy also. So this is like reading. Sometimes it's like reading a gossip magazine, really, and they are talk nastily about other people. So it's quite fun actually just to read it. And what is quite important maybe to remember is that when we think about people like Goethe and Schiller, we kind of see them as grand old men of German literature. But many of them were in their early and mid-20s. So these are very young, rebellious thinkers who have this maybe slightly obnoxious self-confidence of youth. They just think, we are going to change the world. And we know so much more than all the kind of old literary establishment. So you have one who I had great fun researching, is called Novalis. Novalis is actually the only one who has a proper job. He's a mining inspector. All the others are, writers who somehow scrape by, not very, very wealthy at all. And Novalis becomes really in Germany and in America also this the epitome of the young romantic, because he dies quite young. He dies when he's 28 and kind of frozen in time and youth. He is this kind of eternal romantic. And he falls in love with a very young girl, Sophie von Kuhn, who's 12 at the time. He's 22, but it's slightly uncomfortable reading. They get engaged when she's 13, and then she dies when she's 15. And he turns her into this ephemeral kind of angel, really. And he takes Fichte's philosophy and gives it his own very particular twist. So Fichte kind of gives the self, kind of puts the self at center stage of his philosophy. So Novalis decides that after Sophie dies, he really ought to die too. There's no point in living anymore without her. But he's not going to just commit suicide. That would be just far too simple. So he's not going to take a gun and shoot himself. He's going to take his own free will, and that's going to kill himself. So he thinks he can control it so much. So he takes this philosophy. Of course, it doesn't quite work. And after a while, he kind of gives up. But he pushes really hard these boundaries between mind and matter. So
just to clarify, he believes that he can think himself to death.
Yes. He says, well, if the brain can move an arm, surely a brain, for example, could also let an amputated arm grow, or I could just kill myself. It's only for about a year that he tries, and then he kind of works out this is not really working, and he kind of goes on to other things.
But this is important because I haven't yet finished with Fichte, because Fichte is inspired by the great philosopher of the Enlightenment who lives 1,000 miles or so away in Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, Immanuel Kant. And what Fichte does, and what the Jena set, all of your characters together do, is they replace the idea of reason with the idea of self-emotion, and you could have subtitled this book, Me, Me, Me.
Yes.
So what is this, what's happening to sort of thought in Europe because of these characters in Jena?
So what is really happening, let me kind of start backwards. One of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is I'm interested in history because I want to understand why we are who we are. So with Humboldt, I was very much interested in environmentalism and climate change. And with this book, I wanted to really understand why are we such a selfish species, who just, destroys the planet we live on, but also destroy each other. And where's this coming from? And it comes from this moment in Jena. Only we have to, but that's not what Fichte ever intended. It was never a narcissistic celebration of the self. He liberated the self with the intention of creating a better society. So we've just taken it too much to an extreme now. So we are, there's a whole generation called the me generation. We circle around ourselves. But what Fichte said, and that's very important, he said, freedom always comes with moral obligations and moral duty. So we can't just be free and do whatever we want. Freedom gives us the choice how we act and how we behave. So it empowers us, but it doesn't mean we can just...
He's not saying that we can throw off moral responsibility.
Exactly.
In fact, he's saying rather the opposite, isn't he?
Exactly. Yeah. He says it comes with this obligation. You have to be a morally mature person to be free. So you have to educate people in order to kind of deal with this freedom. And I think underpinning this, for me, has always been this... It's this kind of tension between the breathtaking possibilities of the free self and the pitfalls of selfishness. And the questions that are behind this is, who am I as an individual and who am I as a member of a society? So how can I live a life in which I fulfill my dreams, but at the same time I'm a morally good person? How can I reconcile my personal liberties with the demands of a society? And I wrote large parts of this book during the pandemic, and it was quite interesting to see how exactly this question was leading the debate. So most of us gave up our personal liberties because we believed, and kept to lockdown regulations, because we believed that's the right thing to do for the greater good. And then there were some who refused to, who say, no, my liberty is more important. And it's this kind of balancing act that we still are dealing with today, but which really started back then.
Now, of course, as we know, you wrote The Invention of Nature before Magnificent Rebels about Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt pitches up in Jena, but largely because his big brother is there, Wilhelm von Humboldt. Tell us about Wilhelm and what Alexander's experiences are with Goethe, as in particular.
Yeah, so as I said, this is this small town that just attracts more and more kind of famous people. So Wilhelm von Humboldt arrives with his wife, another very strong-willed Caroline. Actually, they arrive together with Caroline's lover, who lives with the Humboldts in their house and who very openly takes part in all the kind of dinner parties and stuff like that. It's totally normal back then. So Wilhelm von Humboldt comes to Jena because of Schiller. He admires him, they become very close friends, and his younger brother, Alexander, visits him, stays with them, and Alexander at that time is in his mid-20s, very much a child of the Enlightenment, very much believes in rational thought, observations, experiments, and he spends a lot of time with Goethe. And it's for Alexander von Humboldt a very, very important time, because it's really Goethe and also the younger generation there, with their emphasis on the self, on the subjective perspective, that becomes so important for him, because he then goes on to South America, understanding this world through the prism of this new philosophy, a philosophy that says feeling, emotion, imagination is all part of our understanding of the world. And that, for me, really is the nexus, the center of Romanticism, the importance of imagination.
And Goethe at this time is experimenting with electricity and frogs and this sort of thing. Do they have an interaction, Humboldt and Goethe?
Yes, they spend weeks and weeks in the anatomy theater, for example, dissecting frogs and mice and people, as you do. Goethe, although he's mainly known as a poet, he is very much a science. He's obsessed with botany. He dissects everything from snails to mice to frog. He has a study which people complain that stinks quite a bit, because they have like decomposing frogs in there and stuff like that. He's very interested in optics, in color theory. So this is a very experimental group of people where science is important as much as poetry. And Novalis actually says that the sciences should all be poeticized, which I think is a kind of just a beautiful thing. And Friedrich Schlegel says that he wants to turn mathematics and physics into poetry. And he said, I really want to make Euclid singable. So it's all about, transcending the boundaries of disciplines and subjects.
Yes, which of course, resonates a lot today when science and art are beginning to learn off each other in many, many ways, in forms of deep research that has never really happened in the way that it happened in the 1790s. We rather went to sleep as a sort of intellectual species after the 1790s.
Yeah, if you think of people like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, he's an artist, an engineer, he's interested in botany and mathematics. This distinction is a relative recent one. And when we went to Alma a few days ago, what was really interesting, I thought, was how they explained to us that the data is so complex that they need artists to communicate what's actually happening out there. They have to visualize the data, because otherwise you can't understand it. So it is so important, and there are many disciplines who understand that now. But that moment in Jena was really when it was brought together in the most profound way.
So you've got this extraordinary activity around science, around literature, around philosophy. It's attracting students. It's also attracting attention by some political authorities as well, because some of the things they're saying are really going beyond what was acceptable in the political regime. What sort of political difficulties did they run into?
So Fichte is one of them who in the end kind of has problems with the authorities in Jena, who actually has to leave Jena, because he arrives in Jena and he starts his lectures by saying, in 20 or 30 years there won't be any kings and princes anymore. So the ruler of the little duchy there is not particularly pleased about this. And in the end, he writes something about God, and he's kind of accused of atheism, which is really not. It was just an excuse to kind of get rid of him, and he moves to Berlin. So they are. Friedrich Schlegel is quite outspoken about the importance of republicanism, They are great supporters of the French Revolution. Schiller at the beginning too, but then when Robespierre's kind of reign of terror kind of happens and, you know, all the heads kind of roll off the guillotines, some of them kind of turn against that. But on the whole, they believe that what's happening in France should also be happening in Germany.
And that is a threat to the existing order throughout Germany, whichever territorial entity it is. Can I say about this book, the reason why this book is so good, if you know German literary scholarship, is German literary scholarship on the whole is witlessly boring. And it is written in a very academic, highfalutin style. And what Andrea has done has unlocked the real personalities of these people because of the sources that she uses, not only their writings, but also archive, documentary sources as well. So it's a really exciting read. Tell us what happens when the whole thing starts falling apart.
Well, so imagine you have a group of rebellious, strong-willed young men and women who declare the self as the supreme ruler of the world. Unsurprisingly, you end up with inflated egos and with some infighting. So after a few years, it doesn't look that great anymore. So they begin to turn against each other. And it really, you know, one after another leaves the town. And it's quite sad to watch how these very tight friendships just crumble as everybody is just kind of, I suppose, taking the kind of philosophy of the self a little bit too literal. And their lives become almost like a platform on which they live out this philosophy. So one after another leaves. You have Caroline, for example, who in the end divorces August Wilhelm Schlegel. She marries Schelling, who's this young philosopher. They all leave. The only one who comes right at the end is Hegel, because he does everything a little bit slower than everybody else. He might now be the most famous of all these philosophers.
I was going to say, the thing is that Hegel, we haven't mentioned history yet, but of course Hegel turns the understanding of history upside down, and Hegel's influence remains huge, to this day, absolutely huge.
But Hegel wouldn't be Hegel without Fichte and Schelling. That's the interesting thing. So the book kind of all ends in 1806 when Napoleon arrives with his. So while this is happening, you have the kind of Napoleonic Wars in Europe.
Huge, vast battles going on everywhere in and around Jena.
Exactly. And then in October 1806, Napoleon arrives with his army of 150,000 soldiers and meets the almighty Prussian army in Jena, this tiny, tiny little town. And it takes a few hours, basically, and Napoleon crushes the Prussian army, houses burn, interestingly, no civilians die, but thousands of soldiers die. When the French leave, Jena is pretty much destroyed. There's no food, there's no drink left. Farmers can't work their fields anymore because all the oxen have been eaten, the horses have been stolen, corpses are kind of like piled up in the streets. So it's really the end of the glory times of Jena. And there's this moment which, you know, if you were a novelist, you'd think that that's a little bit over the top. There's this moment when Napoleon's army arrives, and Hegel has just finished the last pages of his most famous work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. And he puts his only copy in the very last stagecoach that goes out of Jena to send it to his publisher. So with a very great risk that it would have never made it. And you think that, you know, if I would make this up, everybody would say, like, a little bit over the top. But, you know, it happens. And it comes through, and he publishes it the following year. So it's a confluence of so many things that happen in this small place. But also, and I think that's very important for me, of course it's a book about big ideas, but it's also a bit of a soap opera, because there's so much stuff going on. Everybody's having affairs with everybody. They all live together. I think it's really the first commune in Germany. Not forget the 1960s. It was all happened in the 1790s in Jena, and there's a great sense of fun, and we are changing the world. It's just there's a real excitement that kind of like thumbs through the streets of Jena at that time.
And then, of course, it gets picked up by the English Romantics, some of whom, famously Samuel Coleridge, actually just steal a lot of the material from the Jena Romantics.
Yeah. So for me, that was great fun, because as a German, so when I arrived in England almost 30 years ago, people would say, well, we lost the World Cup, but we won the war. This whole kind of thing between the German and the English. And it was quite nice to see that. And the English loved their romantic poets. Wordsworth, Coleridge. And then you kind of suddenly realize, oh no, they were all influenced by the ideas that came out of Jena. So much so that Coleridge actually moves to Germany for 10 months to learn German and to meet his heroes. He runs out of money, annoyingly, so he never makes it quite to Jena. But he returns after 10 months with a trunk full of German books, including Schelling's and Fichte's work. And Schelling, we haven't really talked about Schelling, but Schelling is very important in a sense. He comes up with a philosophy that talks about the unity of self and nature. That's something that very much appeals to Coleridge. What he does is, because very few people can read German, and he just translates Schelling and he passes it on as his own work. So, I mean, blatantly obvious, page after page after page after page. So it becomes very, very important for the German for the English Romantics.
So, Andrea, before I go to see if there are any questions from the audience, just tell me, what is, over the last 2 centuries, what has the impact of what the Jena set has become known as German Romanticism? What has the impact of German Romanticism been on literature and thought and history in Europe and beyond Europe?
Well, I think one interesting thing is, if I would ask around here now and say to you that, what do you associate with Romanticism? We would get very, very different answers, from paintings of lonely figures and kind of moonlit forests to the Romantics, they all turned against rational thought, to passionate declarations of love and candlelit dinner. So it is the whole spectrum, but that is not the Romanticism that is the early Romanticism. It was something much more complex and much more kind of unwieldy. And at the center of it is poetry, but not poetry as we understand it today, but in its ancient Greek meaning, which means creative and productive. And at the center is also imagination. So that is the important thing. And the other thing is, I think, is Schelling's philosophy of the unity between self and nature. So we are part of nature. That was a very new idea. In a sense, it also meant that if we are part of nature, if we are one with nature, that means that if we walk in nature, it's also partly a self-discovery. So this is the moment when you have the poets walking through forests and kind of finding themselves. A lot of us still feel that, and I think it's a very important idea. It is something, in a way, the Romantics have given us the philosophical foundation of something that we all, most of us, I think, feel. Nature can make us happy. Nature can soothe us. Nature can heal us. Nature speaks to something in us that is not rational thought. And they explain why that is, because we are part of nature.
And of course, that's something that Alexander von Humboldt develops extraordinarily, particularly when he's here in South America.
Exactly. So he comes partly he takes these ideas from Jena, but when he travels through South America, he sees these connections. And he also, I think what's not to be underestimated, this kind of nature as this living organism, as this unity with us, it's something also he learns from the indigenous people. So there are several things that come together for Humboldt, but the intellectual foundation really comes from his time in Jena, and then he sees it really here in South America.